Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the second of our 5 essential row crop management webinars this week. Shawn, if you could bring up your presentation, that would be great. I have just put something in the chat box, just a few housekeeping items as we get started here today. I just want to remind everybody that this is our socially distant webinar series for the spring of 2020. And I would like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to also thank our University of Minnesota colleagues, Liz and Lisa, as well as Phyllis, for helping us out with this webinar and partnering on it. So each day at 1 o'clock, we will have a short webinar, 30 minutes or less, on a key topic for row crop management this spring. Today, we are going to have Shawn Shouse presenting on managing stored grain this spring. Tomorrow, we will have a couple more Iowa State engineers presenting on ensuring high quality dry fertilizer applications. On Thursday, Lisa Bankin will present pre-emergence herbicide programs. And on Friday, Jody DeYoung-Hughes will present on tillage options for this spring. Just as a reminder for everybody, if you have issues with technology, please direct questions in the chat box to the panelists so that we can help you out with those. And then if you have any Q&A questions for Shawn, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and I will be moderating those. So please make sure to put questions for Shawn in that Q&A box rather than the chat box. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shawn Shouse. He's an ag engineering field specialist in Southwest Iowa, and we'd like to thank him for speaking today.
Good to be here. Thank you so much. We're going to talk about some grain storage management tips for this spring. And I apologize, there's probably not going to be anything terribly new. In fact, I'm hoping that when you see this, you'll say, gosh, that sounds familiar. I've heard these kinds of advice tips before. So we'll try to touch on 5 key points here. We'll talk about checking stored grain. We'll talk about being safe while you're checking stored grain, because there's some safety issues that are going to be more prevalent this year than normal. Then we'll talk about what you need to be doing if you have grain that is dry in storage this spring, what you need to be doing if you've got grain that did not get completely dried last fall and still needs attention. And worst of all, if you've got grain that you find has gone out of condition through the winter, what you need to be doing with that. So just to start off, check your grain weekly. This is good advice any year, but particularly in a year where the grain quality was questionable or the grain moisture content was higher than you wanted it to be going into storage, then you need to be checking that weekly. It's a huge investment sitting there. When we talk about checking the grain, frequently that involves something like probing the grain. If you've got a temperature probe, that's good to use in the top surface of the grain, or even just something like a tile probe if you don't have a temperature probe. What you're doing there is just checking for sticky spots. If it feels sticky as you're trying to put the probe in, doesn't feel smooth and slick like dry grain, an indication of mold growth in that top surface of the grain. Better than that, maybe, is checking the smell of the air that comes out of the grain when you kick the aeration fan on. A sour smell would indicate severe loss of quality somewhere in that grain. A musty smell might mean that the mold growth is just getting started. If you've got a big aeration fan, a big drying fan, that first flush of air could come out in as quickly as 30 seconds. So if you've got one of the large fans on your bin, you might need 2 people to do this. One at the top of the bin to smell that first flush of air and another one to turn the fan on. With a smaller aeration fan, it could take several minutes, so you might have time to do that all by yourself. If you want to do some additional checking, if you've got temperature probes in the bin, temperature cables or some other temperature probes, that will give you an indication too of mold growth and rising temperature. And even better than temperature is monitoring the carbon dioxide level of the air in the bin. That can give you a warning of mold growth even faster than the smell or odor of that air does. When you're checking grain, though, we want everyone to be safe. So first of all, think about what the surface of the grain should look like. If you've removed any grain from the bin, you should see that inverted cone shape in the center of the bin. If you don't, if it still looks full, even though you know some grain has been removed, could indicate that there's a bridged layer of grain at the top and a hollow void underneath, a very hazardous situation. So make sure that the grain surface looks the way it should. Use a partner and a safety harness when you're entering the bin so that you've got some rescue capabilities already in place if something goes wrong. And wear respiratory protection. That's good for normal grain because of the dust involved in getting in there and moving around on the grain. If the grain has started to spoil, you've got the addition of a significant load of mold spores in there too that can be a respiratory hazard. So wear a proper respirator. And of course, stay out of flowing grain. Never be in the bin when the grain is being moved, removed, when there's any stirring equipment or unloading equipment operating. And to make sure that doesn't happen, lock out the power to any unloading equipment before you go in the bin. That way nobody else could turn that on, not knowing that you were already in the bin. And the last thing there, just be careful on ladders and stairs. Slips and falls are still the #1 cause of accidents and injuries on the farm, and particularly when your feet are wet or muddy, very hazardous climbing stairs and ladders. So be very cautious with those kinds of things. So moving on, what to do. If you've got dry grain, grain that was down to 15% or lower for corn, 13% or lower for beans or wheat, then you're probably in good shape. You just need to check that condition weekly and make sure that it's staying in good condition. So check the odor, that air, check the temperature if you can, probe for sticky spots. And now all you would really need to do is keep that grain as cool as you can going into spring and summer. How you do that is just by aerating anytime the outdoor air conditions are cool and dry. Run a cooling front through the bin to remove any excess heat. Most common place to find that heat would be on the upper surface of the grain because of the heat that collects under the roof and migrates down into that top surface of grain, or on the sunny side wall of the bin. That first several inches from the wall of the bin can start to warm up. So watch those places for temperature going up. If it gets rising too much, look for the opportunity to run a cooling front up through that bin and cool it back down again. When you're not running the aeration fans, go ahead and cover the aeration fans to keep that warm air from coming into the plenum underneath the bin when you're not wanting it to. Just a tarp and some bungee straps can cover that fan and greatly reduce the amount of warm air that gets in unintended. And keep checking that grain weekly. If you've got wet grain that didn't get adequately dried in the fall, then you need to finish drying that now or move that grain out soon. You can refer to the equilibrium moisture content tables to see what natural air drying would do on any given day. If you don't have access to those charts handy, kind of a ballpark figure is you want air that's below about 70% relative humidity in order to do some good active drying with that air. If the air is closer to saturation than that, you're just not going to get very much moisture to come out of the grain into that air. We want this to be done. You want to finish drying here in the month of April, if at all possible. By the time we get into May, two things start working against you. Number one, the temperature of that air is high enough that the grain above the drying front is going to be warm and moist, and it spoils really quickly in those conditions. The other thing is, the later we get into the spring, the greater the drying potential of that air, the more you're going to over dry the bottom part of your bin as you're trying to finish what's above. So we want that to finish in April, if at all possible. If you don't have the equipment to do the drying in the bin, or you feel like you're so far behind that you're just not going to get the drying done, then go ahead and get that grain out of there, get that marketed, moved someplace where you can run it through a high temperature dryer. If by chance you find damaged grain when you check, if there signs of condition loss. You see the mold growth, the temperature is rising, the smell tells you that there's mold in there. Then you need to do two things. Number one, cool it as quickly as possible. You're not going to fix the grain, but you're going to slow down the expansion of that spoiled spot by cooling the grain as soon as possible. And then as soon as you can, get it out of that bin and take it someplace. If it's badly out of condition, you might have to search for alternate markets to not pay too big a penalty for the condition of the grain. Some livestock feeding options might be possible for grain that is spoiled badly enough that you don't want to tolerate the dock you would take in commercial markets. And of course, use caution handling this grain. If it is already molded, there's going to be a lot of mold spores in addition to the dust when you're moving it. It can stick to the bin walls, stand in vertical walls. Those kinds of things create great hazards if you're trying to get in the bin. Never stand under a vertical wall of grain and try to dislodge it. People have been buried in a matter of seconds that way. So be very cautious if you have spoiled grain that needs to be moved. Might be a good time to talk to some experts about some other advice. If you need more information on these topics, we kind of rolled through that quickly. There are a number of things you can look at. There's a nice news release that was done in the crops blog here at Iowa State that covers the topic in a little more detail. Natural air corn drying in the upper Midwest is a fantastic bulletin available from the University of Minnesota. If you're doing natural air drying, gives all the ins and outs and calculations of that. And there's just a lot of good post-harvest drying and grain management information on the University of Minnesota website under corn harvest. Also some good training modules on the Iowa Grain Quality website. And if you just want to talk to a person rather than trying to dig up the resources, just contact your extension ag engineer or crop specialist and they'll steer you to the right kind of resources. So that's a very quick run through my suggestions for spring management, and I'll turn it back over to Megan to see what kind of questions may have come up.
All right, everybody. So thank you, Shawn. We have this Q&A box, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to type those in and I will pass them along to Shawn. And just as another quick reminder, that SciBox folder that I linked to in your chat box has not only the resources that Shawn mentioned, but it also has instructions in there for self-reporting CCA credits. It also has individual folders for each of the presentations this week. So you can access all of the presentations in this Essential Row Crop Management webinar series here. So just as we wait for some questions to come in, Shawn, I was wondering if maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you've been hearing as far as the Iowa grain quality this winter.
Yeah, it's unfortunately a little bit what we expected. We knew there would be more problems than normal this year, and we have heard of some folks who took a load of grain out and found that the condition was not nearly as good as they wanted. Haven't heard of any total disasters where the bin was gone to the point that they couldn't get it out of the bin, but a lot of spoiled grain coming out. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it might just be the first few loads that you take out, because unless your bin is extremely tall and narrow, the grain tends to roll in from the top down as you're unloading. So the first grain you're going to get out of the bin is going to be from that center top of the bin where the spoiling is most frequently happening. So you might be lucky and just get a few loads of low quality grain and get into better stuff beneath that.
All right, we have questions flooding in here. Rapid fire. So the first question is, should you warm grain to, I assume this is within 15 degrees of ambient temperature, or should you keep it cool or cold into June and July?
Yeah, we used to think maybe warming it up a bit in the spring was okay, but more and more experts are saying just keep it cool. There's no really benefit in warming the grain. The reverse airflow patterns don't seem to be an issue from the grain being cooler than the outside air. So I would keep it as cool as you can. The only time I would think about warming grain is if you had cooled it down way below freezing, say down to 20 or less degrees. Then as it does warm up when you're unloading it, you can get a lot of condensation. And if the grain is cold enough, it can freeze that condensation and you can get ice in the bin as you're trying to unload it. But that's rare. That's only if you really super cooled the grain. If you've just got it down in that 25 to 45 degree range, I would just keep it there until you need to unload it.
Perfect. Okay, here's a question about a company called Haber Tech. Maybe you've heard of them. It says, this startup has been advertising heavily in Iowa and across the Corn Belt. Has anyone from the Extension Service analyzed what this company is promoted as it relates to natural air drying? I'm not sure if you know what Haber Tech is.
You know, I've heard the name and I think I even looked at their information, but now I'm struggling to remember off the top of my head what's different about their drying technology. A couple of things that have come up in recent years, more precise control of natural air drying or heated air drying is possible. You can finesse that natural air drying if you want to. Folks have questioned in the past, is it worth the effort of cycling the fans to a higher speed when the air is just right and slow it down to a lower speed when there's not much drying potential, turning the fans completely off on a foggy 100% relative humidity day, those kinds of things. And certainly there are possibilities there, especially with newer, more affordable control systems to squeeze every little bit of efficiency out of your natural air drying that you can. Whether it pays for itself is still may be questionable, but certainly there are possibilities there to squeeze a little bit more efficiency out of that drying process.
Perfect. Okay, Jacob, we can actually put you and Shawn in touch with each other here at the end too, if you'd like to talk about that specific company more closely. All right, one more question here. Well, actually several, but here's one more. Should I move grain from one bin to another bin if the moisture is different?
Not sure I know if the moisture is different. Blending grains at different moisture contents into the same bin is not generally recommended. It just makes it harder to manage the grain if it's at two distinctly different moisture contents. Now, if it's being blended together as it's being moved, there is some advantage there. The grain will tend to equalize between different moisture contents if it's blended together. In fact, we rely on that with stirred heated air drying. We dry the grain at the bottom of the bin, blend it back into the wetter grain above it, and until we get a blended moisture that's on average where we want it to be. But certainly more than 5 points difference between the moisture content of the wet kernels and the dry kernels. Beyond that is not recommended. So I would be cautious about anything where there was more than 5% difference in the moisture content.
All right, your next question is from Kelly. It's, what should you do first if you're outside of a grain bin where someone has gone into the grain bin and appears to be buried or has gotten buried by grain?
So first thing to do, make sure that if there's unloading equipment running, that you turn that off so that the grain stops moving and pulling someone down farther into the bin. Then call for emergency help and then see if you can get any kind of rescue equipment to the person. Now, if they're already underneath the surface of the grain, then you're going to need help yourself to avoid becoming part of the problem when you get into the bin. But stopping any grain movement that might be happening is critical to not letting the situation get any worse, and then getting emergency help there as quickly as you can. It's one of those things. It's easier if you've planned in advance and know exactly what the 911 address for that site is, so that you can give precise directions to emergency personnel, having emergency numbers stored in your cell phone so you can make those calls quickly without having to look up any numbers. Those kinds of things of pre-planning can help.
All right, one more question here. Again, if you have any more questions, feel free to put those in that Q&A box. This question comes from Lisa. Given the business closures right now, are folks able to deliver grain to the elevators, especially if it's in poor condition and they can't deal with it at home? Are we hearing of any issues?
Yeah, good question. And I'm afraid the answer probably is depends. It's worth making some phone calls ahead of time to find out what the delivery options are at a particular grain merchandiser. They may have special provisions, or they may have limitations on what they will take right now. So certainly make some calls ahead of time. Don't make any assumptions about normal grain handling being available.
All right, here's a question from Adam. Any thoughts on drying wet soybeans this spring in the 16 to 17% moisture range?
16 to 17 might be doable if we get favorable conditions here in the next few weeks. You can dry soybeans with natural air. They don't dry quite as quickly as corn does in the bin in most cases. But the only thing to watch out for with soybean drying with natural air is you will tend to split a lot of beans, crack the seed pod and split the beans if the relative humidity of the drying air is too low. So if memory serves me correctly, the bulletin on natural air drying for soybeans says make sure you're not using air with less than 50% relative humidity because that will result in a lot of split beans. But if you can be above 50% but still in the range that has drying potential, you might be able to dry the beans. If you're trying to speed up the drying process, having a thinner layer in the bin will increase the airflow rate from the same fans on the bin. So a partially full bin is going to dry a lot faster than a completely full bin does. So if you're concerned about getting them dry, you might consider moving some of the beans out and then drying just a partial bin rather than a full bin.
All right. Another question. I've seen folks try to puncture a grain bin when someone is trapped to get them out. Should you do that?
In a lot of cases, yes, that is the fastest way to move a large quantity of grain out of the bin and off the person, particularly if they are over the unloading sumps and you don't have an alternate way to get the grain to move around the person. Then cutting holes in the side of the bin can be a way to rapidly get the grain pressure off of that person. Naturally, there is some danger in that, particularly with larger bins. You have to be very cautious about cutting holes. You don't want to rupture the bin and have the whole bin split and collapse on you. But yes, emergency personnel frequently will cut holes on the side of the bin to try to move the grain away from the person who's trapped.
All right. I think unless there are more questions, I just have one more here for you, but I think it's a really good one. This question comes from Jason. It says, when natural air drying in the fall, I've heard two theories for turning fans on and off. Some guidance says never shut fans off until you have pushed the dry band all the way to the top of the bin. The other theory is to turn the fans on and off depending on the outside temperature and relative humidity. Do you have thoughts on which is best?
Yes, not sure that I have come to a complete conclusion on my own. I would be in the camp who probably would lean toward turn the fans on and keep them on until the drying is complete, or the temperature gets below 30 degrees outside and you just don't have any drying potential left in the air anymore. But the only reason for that really is that corn does not re-wet as quickly as it dries, so the risk of re-wetting the corn with damp air is low. You pick up some heat from the drying fan, so when you get past the fan, you'll probably have about 2 degrees higher temperature than you did going into the fan, and that brings the relative humidity down off of 100%. So even when the chart says the outdoor air has no drying potential, by the time it goes through the fan, it may pick up just enough temperature to have a little bit of drying potential. So you may still get a little bit of drying out of it, even on a foggy day or a 100% humidity overnight. So we usually figured you're not going to do much harm at all by leaving the fan on. And by leaving it on, then as soon as the air condition is proper for drying again the next morning, it starts drying. There's no risk of you forgetting to turn the fan back on. The other advantage is right above that drying front, you've got some grain that's wet and relatively warm, can spoil fairly quickly, and keeping the fan on just keeps air moving through there. So if any heat starts to generate in that grain, it gets flushed on out. So there's some things I like about just letting the fan run, but if you have good controls and you're willing to manage that closely, you can probably avoid some electric bill costs that weren't doing you much good by cycling the fan on and off based on the drying potential of that air. I think there's possibilities there, but it's a busy enough time of year. A lot of folks, I think, are better served by just leaving the fan on and not having to worry about making the decisions and getting back there to change the settings. How's that for a confusing answer to a simple question?
I thought it was a pretty good answer. All right, we have one more question here. We are approaching the 1:30 time where we promised that this would be a short session. So we will take this question, and Shawn has his contact information up here on the slide. Feel free to contact him. If you have any further questions, we'll also put this presentation up online on that Minnesota website where you registered. A lot of our corn was lower test weight this fall and was wet. Are there any special impacts the test weight has on drying potential or storability of the grain?
Yes, there are. Research has indicated that low test weight corn does not store as well at the same moisture content as higher test weight corn. Presumably the starches are just more readily available to attack by the mold and insects too. The seed coat is not as intact and solid as on higher test weight corn. So yes, low test weight corn, the advice I've seen is you may want to consider drying that 1 to 2 points lower for the same storage time that you would with corn at a higher test weight. As far as the drying rate or potential, I haven't seen as much about that, but anecdotal comments from folks, they say, I just don't think it's drying as well either, but I haven't seen the research to back that like we have with just the storability and length of storage time available with low test weight corn.
Fantastic. All right, I think that will conclude the Q&A portion of this presentation. Thank you, Shawn, and thanks again to all of you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. to talk about ensuring high quality dry fertilizer applications, and you can catch us the rest of the week as well. Thanks for joining us.